The True Believer, Thoughts on the Nature of Mass Movements by Hoffer. Chapter 18. Good and Bad Mass Movements. The Unattractiveness and Sterility of the Active Phase. Section 117. This book concerns itself chiefly with the active phase of mass movements, the phase molded and dominated by the true believer. It is in this phase that mass movements of all types often manifest the common traits we have tried to outline. Now, it seems to be true that no matter how noble the original purpose of a movement, and however beneficent the end result, its active phase is bound to strike us as unpleasant, if not evil. The fanatic, who personifies this phase, is usually an unattractive human type. He is ruthless, self-righteous, credulous, disputatious, petty, and rude. He is often ready to sacrifice relatives and friends for his holy cause. The absolute unity and the readiness for self-sacrifice which give an active movement its irresistible drive and enable it to undertake the impossible are usually achieved at a sacrifice of much that is pleasant and precious in the autonomous individual. No mass movement, however sublime its faith and worthy its purpose, can be good if its active phase is overlong, and particularly if it is continued after the movement is in undisputed possession of power. Such mass movements as we consider more or less beneficent, the Reformation, the Puritan, French, and American revolutions, and many of the nationalist movements of the past 100 years, had active phases which were relatively short, though while they lasted they bore to a greater or lesser degree the imprint of the fanatic. The mass movement leader who benefits his people and humanity knows not only how to start a movement, but, like Gandhi, when to end its active phase. Where a mass movement preserves for generations the patterns shaped by its active phase, as in the case of the militant church throughout the Middle Ages, or whereby a successive accession of fanatical proselytes, its orthodoxy is continually strengthened, as in the case of Islam. The result is an era of stagnation, a dark age. Wherever we find a period of genuine creativeness associated with a mass movement, it is almost always a period which either precedes or more often follows the active phase. Provided the active phase of the movement is not too long and does not involve excessive bloodletting and destruction. Its termination, particularly when it is abrupt, often releases a burst of creativeness. This seems to be true both when the movement ends in triumph, as in the case of the Dutch Rebellion, or when it ends in defeat, as in the case of the Puritan Revolution. It is not the idealism and the fervor of the movement which are the cause of any cultural renaissance which may follow it, but rather the abrupt relaxation of collective discipline and the liberation of the individual from the stifling atmosphere of blind faith and the disdain of his self and the present. Sometimes the craving to fill the void left by the lost or deserted holy cause becomes a creative impulse. The active phase itself is sterile. Trotsky knew that periods of high tension and social passions leave little room for contemplation and reflection. All the muses, even the plebeian muse of journalism, in spite of her sturdy hips, have hard sledding in times of revolution. On the other hand, Napoleon and Hitler were mortified by the anemic quality of the literature and art produced in their heroic age, and clamored for masterpieces which would be worthy of the mighty deeds of the times. They had not an inkling that the atmosphere of an active movement cripples or stifles the creative spirit. Milton, who in 1640 was a poet of great promise, with a draft of Paradise Lost in his pocket, spent 20 sterile years of pamphlet writing while he was up to his neck in the sea of noises and hoarse disputes, which was the Puritan Revolution. With the Revolution dead and himself in disgrace, he produced Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, and Samson agonists. Section 118. The interference of an active mass movement with the creative process is deep-reaching and manifold. 1. The fervor it generates drains the energies which would have flowed into creative work. Fervor has the same effect on creativeness as dissipation. 2. It subordinates creative work to the advancement of the movement. Literature, art, and science must be propagandistic, and they must be practical. The true believing writer, artist, or scientist does not create to express himself, or to save his soul, or to discover the true and the beautiful. His task, as he sees it, is to warn, to advise, to urge, to glorify, and to denounce. 3. Where a mass movement opens vast fields of action, war, colonization, industrialization, there is an additional drain of creative energy. 4. The fanatical state of mind by itself can stifle all forms of creative work. The fanatic's disdain for the present blinds him to the complexity and uniqueness of life. The things which stir the creative worker seem to him either trivial or corrupt. Our writers must march in serried ranks, and he who steps off the road to pick flowers is like a deserter. These words of Konstantin Simonov echo the thought and the very words of fanatics through the ages. Said Rabbi Jacob, 1st century A.D., he who walks in the way and interrupts his study of the Torah, saying, "How beautiful is this tree," or "How beautiful is this plowed field," has made himself guilty against his own soul. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux could walk all day by the Lake of Geneva and never see the lake. In Refinement of the Arts, David Hume tells of the monk, quote, who, because the windows of his cell opened upon a noble prospect, made a covenant with his eyes never to turn that way. Unquote. The blindness of the fanatic is a source of strength. He sees no obstacles, but it is the cause of intellectual sterility and emotional monotony. The fanatic is also mentally cocky and hence barren of new beginnings. At the root of his cockiness is the conviction that life and the universe conform to a simple formula, his formula. He is thus without the fruitful intervals of groping, when the mind is, as it were, in solution, ready for all manner of new reactions, new combinations, and new beginnings. Section 119. When an act of mass movement displays originality, it is usually an originality of application and of scale. The principles, methods, techniques, etc., which a mass movement applies and exploits are usually the product of a creativeness which was, or still is, active outside the sphere of the movement. All active mass movements have that unabashed imitativeness, which we have come to associate with the Japanese. Even in the field of propaganda, the Nazis and the Communists imitate more than they originate. They sell their brand of holy cause the way the capitalist advertiser sells his brand of soap or cigarettes. Much that strikes us as new in the method of the Nazis and Communists stems from the fact that they are running or trying to run vast territorial empires the way a Ford or a DuPont runs his industrial empire. It is perhaps true that the success of the communist experiment will always depend on the unfettered creativeness proceeding in the outside non-communist world. The brazen men in the Kremlin think it is a magnanimous concession when they say that communism and capitalism can continue for long, side by side. Actually, if there were no free societies outside the communist orbit, they might have found it necessary to establish them by ukase. Some factors which determine the length of the active phase, section 120. A mass movement with a concrete, limited objective is likely to have a shorter active phase than a movement with a nebulous, indefinite objective. The vague objective is perhaps indispensable for the development of chronic extremism. Said Oliver Cromwell, quote, "A man never goes so far as when he does not know whither he is going." Unquote. When a mass movement is set in motion to free a nation from tyranny, either domestic or foreign, or to resist an aggressor, or to renovate a backward society, there is a natural point of termination once the struggle with the enemy is over or the process of reorganization is nearing completion. On the other hand, when the objective is an ideal society of perfect unity and selflessness, whether it be the city of God, a communist heaven on earth, or Hitler's warrior state, the active phase is without an automatic end. Where unity and self-sacrifice are indispensable for the normal functioning of a society, everyday life is likely to be either religified, common tasks turned into holy causes, or militarized. In either case, the pattern developed by the active phase is likely to be fixed and perpetuated. Jacob Burckhardt and Ernest Renan were among the very few in the hopeful second half of the 19th century who sensed the ominous implications lurking in the coming millennium. Burckhardt saw the militarized society, quote, "I have a premonition which sounds like utter folly, and yet which positively will not leave me. The military state must become one great factory. What must logically come is a definite and supervised stint of misery, with promotions and in uniform, daily begun and ended to the sound of drums." End quote. Renan's insight went deeper. He felt that socialism was the coming religion of the Occident, and that being a secular religion, it would lead to a religification of politics and economics. He also feared a revival of Catholicism as a reaction against the new religion. Quote, "Let us tremble. At this very moment, perchance, the religion of the future is in the making, and we have no part in it. Credulity has deep roots. Socialism may bring back, by the complicity of Catholicism, a new Middle Age, with barbarians, churches, eclipses of liberty and individuality, in a word, of civilization." End quote. Section 121. There is perhaps some hope to be derived from the fact that in most instances, where an attempt to realize an ideal society gave birth to the ugliness and violence of a prolonged active mass movement, the experiment was made on a vast scale and with a heterogeneous population. Such was the case in the rise of Christianity and Islam, and in the French, Russian, and Nazi revolutions. The promising communal settlements in the small state of Israel and the successful programs of socialization in the small Scandinavian states indicate that perhaps when the attempt to realize an ideal society is undertaken by a small nation with a more or less homogeneous population, it can proceed and succeed in an atmosphere which is neither hectic nor coercive. The horror a small nation has of wasting its precious human material, its urgent need for internal harmony and cohesion as a safeguard against aggression from without, and finally the feeling of its people that they are all of one family, make it possible to foster a readiness for utmost cooperation without recourse to either religification or militarization. It would probably be fortunate for the Occident if the working out of all extreme social experiments were left wholly to small states with homogeneous, civilized populations. The principle of a pilot plant, practiced in the large mass production industries, could thus perhaps be employed in the realization of social progress. That the small nation should give the Occident the blueprint of a hopeful future would in itself be part of a long-established pattern. For the small states of the Middle East, Greece and Italy have given us our religion and the essential elements of our culture and civilization. There is one other connection between the quality of the masses and the nature and duration of an active mass movement. The fact is that the Japanese, Russians, and Germans, who allow the interminable continuation of an active mass movement without a show of opposition, were inured to submissiveness or iron discipline for generations before the rise of their respective modern mass movements. Lenin was aware of the enormous advantage the submissiveness of the Russian masses gave him. Quote, "How can you compare," he exclaimed, "the masses of Western Europe with our people, so patient, so accustomed to privation?" Unquote. Whoever reads what Madame de Stael said of the Germans over a century ago cannot but realize what ideal material they are for an interminable mass movement. "The Germans," she said, "are vigorously submissive. They employ philosophical reasonings to explain what is the least philosophic thing in the world, respect for force and the fear which transforms that respect into admiration. One cannot maintain with certitude that it would be impossible for a Hitler or a Stalin to rise in a country with an established tradition of freedom. What can be asserted with some plausibility is that in a traditionally free country, a Hitler or Stalin might not find it too difficult to gain power, but extremely hard to maintain himself indefinitely. Any marked improvement in economic conditions would almost certainly activate the tradition of freedom, which is a tradition of revolt. In Russia, as pointed out in Section 45, the individual who pitted himself against Stalin had nothing to identify himself with, and his capacity to resist coercion was nil. But in a traditionally free country, the individual who pits himself against coercion does not feel as isolated human atom, but one of a mighty race, his rebellious ancestors. Section 122. The personality of a leader is probably a crucial factor in determining the nature and duration of a mass movement. Such rare leaders as Lincoln and Gandhi not only try to curb the evil inherent in a mass movement, but are willing to put an end to the movement when its objective is more or less realized. They are of the very few in whom power has developed a grandeur and generosity of the soul. Stalin's medieval mind and his tribal ruthlessness were chief factors in the prolonged dynamism of the communist movement. It is futile to speculate on what the Russian Revolution might have been like had Lenin lived a decade or two longer. One has the impression that he was without that barbarism of the soul so evident in Hitler and Stalin. Whereas Heraclitus said, "Make our eyes and ears evil witnesses to the doings of men." Stalin molded his possible successors in his own image, and the Russian people can probably expect more of the same for the next several decades. Cromwell's death brought the end of the Puritan Revolution, while the death of Robespierre marked the end of the active phase of the French Revolution. Had Hitler died in the middle of the 1930s, Nazism would probably have shown, under the leadership of a Göring, a fundamental change in its course, and the Second World War might have been averted. Yet, the sepulchre of Hitler, the founder of a Nazi religion, might perhaps have been a greater evil than all the atrocities, bloodshed, and destruction of Hitler's war. Section 123. The manner in which a mass movement starts out can also have some effect on the duration and mode of termination of the active phase of the movement. When we see the Reformation, the Puritan, American, and French revolutions, and many of the nationalist uprisings terminate after a relatively short active phase in a social order marked by increased individual liberty, we are witnessing the realization of moods and examples which characterize the earliest days of these movements. All of them started out by defying and overthrowing a long-established authority. The more clear-cut this initial act of defiance, and the more vivid its memory in the minds of the people, the more likely is the eventual emergence of individual liberty. There was no such clear-cut act of defiance in the rise of Christianity. It did not start by overthrowing a king, a hierarchy, a state, or a church. Martyrs there were, but not individuals shaking their fists under the nose of proud authority and defying it in the view of the whole world. Hence, perhaps, the fact that the authoritarian order ushered in by Christianity endured almost unchallenged for 1,500 years. The eventual emancipation of the Christian mind at the time of the Renaissance in Italy drew its inspiration not from the history of early Christianity, but from the stirring examples of individual independence and defiance in the Greco-Roman past. There is a similar lack of a dramatic act of defiance at the birth of Islam and of the Japanese collective body, and in neither are there even now signs of genuine individual emancipation. German nationalism, too, unlike the nationalism of most Western nations, did not start with a spectacular act of defiance against established authority. It was taken under the wing from its beginning by the Prussian army. The seed of individual liberty in Germany is in its Protestantism and not its nationalism. The Reformation, the American, French, and Russian revolutions, and most of the nationalist movements opened with a grandiose overture of individual defiance, and the memory of it is kept green. By this test, the eventual emergence of individual liberty in Russia is perhaps not entirely hopeless. Useful mass movements. Section 124. In the eyes of the true believer, people who have no holy causes are without a backbone and character, a pushover for men of faith. On the other hand, the true believers of various hues, though they view each other with mortal hatred and are ready to fly at each other's throats, recognize and respect each other's strength. Hitler looked on the Bolsheviks as his equals and gave orders that former communists should be admitted to the Nazi Party at once. Stalin, in his turn, saw in the Nazis and the Japanese the only nations worthy of respect. Even the religious fanatic and the militant atheist are not without respect for each other. Dostoevsky puts the following words in Bishop Taihone's mouth. Quote, outright atheism is more to be respected than worldly indifference. The complete atheist stands on the penultimate step to the most perfect faith. But the indifferent person has no faith whatever, except a bad fear. Unquote. All the true believers of our time, whether communist, Nazi, fascist, Japanese, or Catholic, declaimed volubly, and the communists still do, on the decadence of the Western democracies. The burden of their talk is that in the democracies people are too soft, too pleasure-loving, and too selfish to die for a nation, a god, or a holy cause. This lack of readiness to die, we are told, is indicative of an inner rot, a moral and biological decay. The democracies are old, corrupt, and decadent. They are no match for the virile congregations of the faithful who are about to inherit the earth. There is a grain of sense, and more than a grain of nonsense, in these declamations. The readiness for united action and self-sacrifice is, as indicated in Section 43, a mass movement phenomenon. In normal times, a democratic nation is an institutionalized association of more or less free individuals. When its existence is threatened and it has to unify its people and generate in them a spirit of utmost self-sacrifice, the democratic nation must transform itself into something akin to a militant church or a revolutionary party. This process of religification, though often difficult and slow, does not involve deep-reaching changes. The true believers themselves imply that the decadence they declaim about so volubly is not an organic decay. According to the Nazis, Germany was decadent in the 1920s and wholly virile in the 1930s. Surely a decade is too short a time to work significant biological or even cultural changes in a population of millions. It is nevertheless true that in times like the Hitler decade, the ability to produce a mass movement in short order is of vital importance to a nation. The mastery of the art of religification is an essential requirement in the leader of a democratic nation, even though the need to practice it might not arise. And it is perhaps true that extreme intellectual fastidiousness or a businessman's practical mindedness disqualifies a man for national leadership. There are also perhaps certain qualities in the normal life of a democratic nation which can facilitate the process of religification in time of crisis, and are therefore the elements of a potential national virility. The measure of a nation's potential virility is as the reservoir of its longing. The saying of Heraclitus, that it would not be better for mankind if they were given their desires, is true of nations as well as of individuals. When a nation ceases to want things fervently or directs its desires toward an ideal that is concrete and limited, its potential virility is impaired. Only a goal which lends itself to continued perfection can keep a nation potentially virile, even though its desires are continually fulfilled. The goal need not be sublime. The gross ideal of an ever-rising standard of living has kept this nation fairly virile. England's ideal of the country gentleman and France's ideal of the retired rentier are concrete and limited. This definiteness of their national ideal has perhaps something to do with the lessened drive of the two nations. In America, Russia, and Germany, the ideal is indefinite and unlimited. Good and bad mass movements, Section 125. As indicated in Section 1, mass movements are often a factor in the awakening and renovation of stagnant societies. Though it cannot be maintained that mass movements are the only effective instrument of renaissance, it seems yet to be true that in large and heterogeneous social bodies such as Russia, India, China, the Arabic world, and even Spain, the process of awakening and renovation depends on the presence of some widespread fervent enthusiasm, which perhaps only a mass movement can generate and maintain. When the process of renovation has to be realized in short order, mass movements may be indispensable, even in the small homogeneous societies. The inability to produce a full-fledged mass movement can be, therefore, a grave handicap to a social body. It has probably been one of China's great misfortunes during the past 100 years that its mass movements, the Taiping Rebellion and the Sun Yat-sen Revolution, deteriorated or were stifled too soon. China was unable to produce a Stalin, a Gandhi, or even an Ataturk who could keep a genuine mass movement going long enough for drastic reforms to take root. Ortega and Gasset is of the opinion that the inability of a country to produce a genuine mass movement indicates some ethnological defect. He says of his own Spain that its, quote, ethnological intelligence has always been an atrophied function and has never had a normal development, unquote. It is probably better for a country that when its government begins to show signs of chronic incompetence, it should be overthrown by a mighty mass upheaval, even though such overthrow involves a considerable waste of life and wealth, than that it should be allowed to fall and crumble of itself. A genuine popular upheaval is often an invigorating, renovating, and integrating process where governments are allowed to die a lingering death. The result is often stagnation and decay, perhaps irremediable decay. And since men of words usually play a crucial role in the rise of mass movements, it is obvious that the presence of an educated and articulate minority is probably indispensable for the continued vigor of a social body. It is necessary, of course, that the men of words should not be in intimate alliance with the established government. The long social stagnation of the Orient has many causes, but there's no doubt that one of the most important is the fact that for centuries the educated were not only few, but almost always part of the government, either as officials or priests. The revolutionary effect of the educational work done by Western colonizing powers has already been mentioned. One wonders whether India's capacity to produce a Gandhi and a Nehru is due less to rare elements in Indian culture than to the long presence of the British Raj. Foreign influence seems to be a prevailing factor in the process of social renaissance. Jewish and Christian influences were active in the awakening of Arabia at the time of Muhammad. In the awakening of Europe from the stagnation of the Middle Ages, we also find foreign influences, Greco-Roman and Arabic. Western influences were active in the awakening of Russia, Japan, and several Asiatic countries. The important point is that the foreign influence does not act in a direct way. It is not the introduction of foreign fashions, manners, speech, ways of thinking, and of doing things which shakes a social body out of its stagnation. The foreign influence acts mainly by creating an educated minority where there was none before, or by alienating an existing articulate minority from the prevailing dispensation. And it is this articulate minority which accomplishes the work of Renaissance by setting in motion a mass movement. In other words, the foreign influence is merely the first link in a chain of processes, the last link of which is usually a mass movement. And it is the mass movement which shakes the social body out of its stagnation. In the case of Arabia, the foreign influences alienated the man of words Muhammad from the prevailing dispensation in Mecca. Muhammad started a mass movement, Islam, which shook and integrated Arabia for a time. In the time of the Renaissance, the foreign influences, Greco-Roman and Arabic, facilitated the emergence of men of words who had no connection with the church, and also alienated many traditional men of words from the prevailing Catholic dispensation. The resulting movement of the Reformation shook Europe out of its torpor. In Russia, European influence, including Marxism, detached the allegiance of the intelligentsia from the Romanovs. And the eventual Bolshevik Revolution is still at work, renovating the vast Muscovite Empire. In Japan, the foreign influence reacted not on men of words, but on a rare group of men of action which included Emperor Meiji. These practical men of action had the vision which Peter the Great, also a man of action, lacked. And they succeeded where he failed. They knew that the mere introduction of foreign customs and foreign methods would not stir Japan to life, nor could it drive it to make good in decades the backwardness of centuries. They recognize that the art of religification is an indispensable factor in so unprecedented a task. They set in motion one of the most effective mass movements of modern times. The evils of this movement are abundantly illustrated throughout this book. Yet, it is doubtful whether any other agency of whatever nature could have brought about the phenomenal feat of renovation, which has been accomplished in Japan. In Turkey, too, the foreign influence reacted on a man of action, Ataturk, and the last link in the chain was a mass movement. J.B.S. Haldane counts fanaticism among the only 4 really important inventions made between 3000 B.C. and 1400 A.D. It was a Judaic-Christian invention, and it is strange to think that in receiving this malady of the soul, the world also received a miraculous instrument for raising societies and nations from the dead, an instrument of resurrection.